The Secrets of the Gaunt's Chappel. English Folk Tales. This one is from Gloucestershire. King Henry VII enjoyed his stay at the manor of Acton Court, whose peaceful gardens and fields were much preferable to the noisy, smelly city of Bristol, where on occasion he had business with the merchants. Sir Robert Poyntz had reason to be hospitable, having been knighted by Henry after the Battle of Bosworth Field that won him the crown, but the king's visit was quite an imposition, with his train of many courtiers, servants, and soldiers. In this entourage there was a young courtier called John Coleman. Amidst the hustle and bustle, no one noticed how this young man caught the eye of Sir Robert's raven-haired young daughter, Mary. Discreetly, they slipped away to walk together among the tall clipped hedges. John was not yet 20, Mary a few years younger. In just 2 days, they'd fallen in love. In a shadowy green lane between 2 yew hedges, they held hands and gazed in each other's eyes and pledged their undying love. Unfortunately, they were not as alone as they thought. Sir Robert had noticed his daughter's absence and learned from a gardener that she had been headed to the secluded part of the grounds. From behind the hedge, he heard their few words and their vigorous teenage kissing. Out he leapt, furious as the devil. "Keep away from my daughter, you villain, or you'll feel for sure the weight of the clenched fist." By clenched fist, he referred to the Ponitz rebus, point being a pun on the family name. From the look on Sir Robert's face, John could believe he meant the threat more literally. "As for you, my young trollop, away with you to your room. Let's see if a diet of bread and water won't cool your blood." In tears of anguish, Mary fled to the house. Sobbing in her room, she pulled from her hair what her father hadn't seen, the gold bodkin John had slotted there as a token of his eternal love. She trusted his pledge with all her heart, and that he'd find a way to come for her. All she had to do was wait. Meanwhile, Sir Robert complained to the king. "With the greatest respect, sire, it is a trespass to our hospitality that one of your young majesty's young fellows should make advances to my daughter of such tender years." Cunning King Henry valued Sir Robert's friendship. He dismissed John Coleman at once from his service and sent him packing back to London. John loved Mary Ponitz with all his heart, but he hadn't a hope of marrying her until he first distinguished himself in some way. He had neither money nor rank. He was no warrior. He decided his best bet was to become a scholar, so thereby to become of use to the king and be taken back to his service. To Padua he went. He studied with all the vigor of his yearning to make himself worthy of Mary. He heard no word from her, but he trusted her, that she would be faithful to their pledge. He didn't dare write for fear her father would intercept their letters. Skill in scholarship, the learning of languages, takes time. The years pass by quicker than you'd ever expect they will. John was a man past 30 when at last his friends at court secured from the new king, Henry VIII, his appointment to a diplomatic post in which his linguistic skills could be put to use in reaping intelligence for the crown. John's heart soared with the dream that at last seemed in reach. He risked a letter to Mary, via a friend of a friend, telling her about his appointment, declaring his undiminished love, hoping they might soon consummate their love before God. In Calais, awaiting the ship to England, he met an acquaintance of his youth who had connections in Gloucestershire. Pretending in a nonchalance he did not feel, he asked the man what news of the Ponitz of Iron Acton. "All Sir Robert's soldiers on. He has a place in the Queen's household." "And his children?" "Married and breeding, most of them." John fought to keep the tremor from his voice. "And married too?" "Not married yet, despite her years." John had let go of a sigh of relief. "But the rich old gentleman from outside the country has lately made an offer. and she has accepted him. There was more to the story of Mary's engagement than John's informant knew. All these years she had avoided any entanglement. Her heart had been loyal to John. But when his latest offer came, she was nigh on 30, and her father, perceiving the advantage of the alliance, insisted she accept, on pain of being shut away in a nunnery. She resisted as long as she could, till not only was she convinced her father would carry on his threat, but a friend in whom she confided said, "Open your eyes to the truth. If your sweetheart hasn't come for you by now, has never written, you can be sure he'll forgotten all about you by now, and he'd be married to a wench more fitting to his rank." Reluctantly, Mary yielded to her aged suitor's proposal. But then, only a few days before John reached Calais, John's letter arrived, delayed by its circuitous route. At once all her feelings were awoken. She remembered that day between the yew hedges, his lips on hers, his hands on her waist. She felt a churning in her loins, such as she'd never known before, all the stronger because her natural instincts had been held in check so many years. She could not marry the man she was betrothed to. Better to go to the nunnery than marry anyone but her beloved John. It never came to that. Her father died. Her brother, Sir Anthony, who inherited his estate, wanted her to be happy, and his wife, Lady Jane, was her good friend. Mary was free to break her engagement. On tenterhooks she waited at Acton Court for John Coleman to come. John knew none of this, only that Mary had accepted another. He never boarded the ship from Calais. His hopes and dreams were shattered. England held nothing for him, except the memory of the love he'd lost. He didn't know where to go, except away from England. Fate took him to the Rhine, where he found a refuge in a monastery in which his scholarly skills were appreciated. He could not think of finding love with any other woman. Better to devote his unspent passion to God. He became a monk and a priest. He passed his days in study and prayer. He tried not to think of Mary. The years passed, like a stream running a quick beneath the bridge, and John cared not. The passing of the years of his life could only bring him closer to his destiny in God. Then one day the monastery had a visitor, an Englishman returning from Rome. His name was John Essex, and he was the abbot of St. Augustine's in Bristol. Just to hear mention of Bristol, a place so close to Acton Court, made John Coleman tremble inside. He wanted to ask after Mary Ponitz, as he'd done in Calais long years before, but he was now a man of God. It would be a peril to his soul even to speak her name. The abbot was a shrewd man, and might have divined the true import of such a question. As it was, he was impressed by John's abilities, and perceived it in his conversation a longing for England, and Gloucestershire especially. "Listen, Coleman, the mastership of the Gaunt hospital is vacant, and falls under my jurisdiction. If you'd like the job, it's yours." The Gaunt hospital was a priory adjunct to St. Augustine's Abbey, with a mission to feed the poor. I dare say Bristol's proximity to the Action Court was one reason John accepted the invitation. But upon arriving in the city, he was determined to discipline his soul and made no attempt to contact Mary, whom he presumed to be married and perhaps dwelling far from Iron Acton. Spiritual peril turned out to be closer than John expected. Before he died, Sir Robert Ponitz had paid for a splendid fan-vaulted chantry chapel to be added to the hospital's church. There he was buried, and there members of his family often came to pray. Moreover, as the house now had only 4 resident brothers, there was space for a few lady gentlefolk to stay as boarders, of whom one was Lady Jane, the widow of Mary's brother. One day, as John passed Jane's quarters, he saw her welcoming a guest, a woman, slender in build, dressed in black like a widow, with raven hair threaded with grey. It was just a glimpse before the 2 women vanished behind the door, but John's heart began to thud in response to something about that black figure, something perhaps in the motion of shoulders as they turned. He told himself it was in his imagination. He made himself attend to his duties and devotions. But the very next day, in the Ponies' chapel, when he thought he'd finished the queue of the penitents he'd been confessing, he saw one last figure waiting at the entrance, the woman in black. For a moment, the image of the girls he'd carried in his memory was superimposed on that of the middle-aged woman before him, her face gaunt and pale, the bloom of youth spent. Yet she was beautiful to him, and he loved her as much as he always had. In the cover of his alcove, he gave no sign that he knew her. He lowered his eyes from the alabaster curve of her cheek, and as the blood thudded in his temple, he listened to her confession. Father, I have sinned, if sin it be. Since my youth I have been consumed with the love for a man I met then. For years I hoped and prayed he would come to me one day, as he'd pledged. Because of this love, I refused all offers of marriage. I remained a burden on my family, and my heart and mind and body have so burned with unrequited desire that I have failed to give to God the devotion that is his due. John could barely speak to say the words of absolution. He watched with dismay the frailty with which the woman rose from her knees and walked, almost tottering, from the chapel, having betrayed no sign that she knew who he was. For hours afterwards he sat there. She'd kept faith to their pledge after all. She'd never ceased to wait for him, and he perceived what toll her love-sickness had taken on her strength, as she'd not had the solace he'd found in the monastic routine of study and prayer. What might have been? It was unbearable to contemplate. You might say it was not too late. They could still find love in these late years. But it was a sacred bond that John had made with God. His renunciation of the flesh was absolute. In truth, though, it really was too late. Not many days later, he was summoned by Sir Nicholas Ponitz, grandson of Sir Robert, to attend a dying person at Action Court. In great consternation, hoping against hope it might be some aged retainer who'd run life's natural course, John rode out to the manor to which he'd come in the king's train all those years before. When he arrived, the steward told him in sombre tones that death had beaten him to the door. He was shown into the chamber where Mary Ponitz lay pale and still in her bed. In death, the lines in her face had softened, so she looked almost as youthful as he remembered her. By her bed was a letter addressed to the master of the Gaunt's hospital. Had she known him after all when she came to the confession? Dripping tears on the parchment, he opened the seal. The letter contained only a formal request. I wish to be buried in the Ponitz chapel, dressed in white silk gown that may be found in my wardrobe, and that has never been worn, and that in my hair be placed a pin encrusted with this letter. John upturned the envelope. Into his trembling hand fell the gold bodkin he had given her when they pledged their undying love. He buried her as she instructed, in the chantry chapel, dressed in her wedding gown, the bodkin in her hair. Ever afterwards, he made his private devotions in that chapel. He prayed for Mary's soul, and in the secrecy of his heart, he prayed to her as well, as if she were his God, and begged her forgiveness for his lack of faith. Even such a private matter of the heart is not immune to the tides of history. Once he'd broken with Rome, Henry VIII was eager to seize the lands and wealth of England's monasteries. On the 9th of September, 1539, John Coleman surrendered the Gaunt hospital to the king's commissioners and was paid off with a pension. He would have had a king welcome back in the monastery on the Rhine, but instead he took cottage in Gaunt's Lane, so that he may always be near Mary. There he lived to a great age, cultivating his little garden behind the church in which the body of his beloved Mary lay. The story was recounted by Anthony Nansen. Anthony Nansen has performed internationally as a storyteller and co-produced with storytelling company Firesprings such acrobatic epics as Arthur's Dream, Robin of the Wildwood, Return to Arcadia, and Dark Age Deeds of the Celtic Saints. His books include Gloucestershire Folktales, Exotic Excursions, Words of Reenchantment, Storytelling for a Greener World, co-editor, Gloucestershire Ghost Tales, co-author, and Deep Time. My source for this story is Joseph Leach's Brief Romances from Bristol History, 1884. When I visited the Gaunt's Chappel, latterly the Lord Mayor's Chapel, I discovered that the story had survived in local knowledge, for the verger knew about it and showed me in the alcoves in the Chantry Chapel where Mary makes her confession.